Well, thank you, Simon and Richard. And indeed, it's first my pleasure to thank a collection of people. To begin with, we're here at the Australasian Econometric Society meetings in the great city of Melbourne. That's a real pleasure. And personally, I am here just after coming from a wonderful visit to the ANU in Canberra. And so I thank those of my hosts from the ANU that are here today. I thank Monash University, the Department of Economics, and the Department of Econometrics and Business Statistics who staged this meeting. Simon Wilkie, the dean from whom we've heard. Russell Smythe, the Deputy Dean of Research, contributed to this. And then over the next few days, we're going to enjoy the great work of our program committee, Heather Anderson, Lata Ganganjaram, G.T. Gao, Yves Zenau. In the meantime, we're going to be taken care of by the local committee chairs who, together with the program committee, have spent probably most of their thoughts this past year, every waking moment this past week, and probably every moment, waking or not, these next few days, taking care of us. This includes some as Moslehi, Bin Peng, Liang Chun Wang, and Wei Wei. We have an impressive list of sponsors for this conference, and so we thank the Monash Business School, the Reserve Bank of Australia, the Australian Treasury, the Australian Bureau of Statistics, the Victorian Department of Treasury and Finance, the Centre for Health Economics, the Melbourne Industrial Organization Workshop, RBB Economics, all of whom contributed to bringing us together here today. The Econometric Society has sponsors that we should thank. These include the BBVA Foundation, the Coles Foundation, the European Central Bank, and then especially all of you sitting out here, the fellows and members of the Econometric Society who contribute in so many ways, financially and otherwise, to making the society go. Locally, broadly construed locally, we have the Australasian Regional Standing Committee. Richard Holden has been its chair for some time. I want to thank and give good wishes to Lisa Cameron, who's our outgoing secretary, and to welcome Begonia Dominguez, who's the incoming secretary. Certainly look forward to working with her. And finally, the Econometric Society staff who do so much behind the scenes. There's Bart Lippman, our executive vice president, and in the office, Lynn Hogan and Ritu Johuri, and Mary Beth Belando Zanaboni. So all of these people we have to thank for bringing us together here today. It's a great pleasure, a great honor for me to spend, starting now and in the next year, as a member of the Econometric Society, going to meetings in some of the world's great cities and great capitals, and Melbourne's as good a start as I can imagine for that. So thank you all for coming. Now I'm going to talk about modeling people who use models, a title sufficiently ambiguous that will stretch it to serve various purposes as we go along. I'm going to talk about, or hope to raise, what I view as some basic questions that I think we as economists need to think about, need to understand better, things that I regard as great topics for further work. As I go along, I'm going to very shamelessly refer very frequently to my own work and very parsimoniously to the work of others. And my apology for that is I view that as putting my money where my mouth is. When I mention that I've worked on these things, that's my way of saying I really do think these are important topics. And when I come to the questions, that'll be my way of saying, but we collectively have still made just a bit of progress on these things, and there's lots more that we need to be doing. Okay, so here's the basic setting, the sort of departure for all of economics. We have a person who has to make a decision. And how do we think about people making decisions? We typically model this with something that looks like this. This is one of the few pieces of notation we'll see today, and we even don't need to bother with most of this. We just need to think about the pieces that go into our model of people making decisions. There's usually a utility function. This describes the person's preferences. There's a set of alternatives, a feasible set over which that utility function is defined. We need that. There might be some uncertainty, and so we have to have some beliefs about how the uncertainty is going to resolve, and there might be some information arriving in the course of that, so we need some way of talking about how the person updates their beliefs in light of that information. And so we put these things together. This is we, the analysts, model of how we make these decisions. And in keeping with the ambiguity of the title, sometimes we will be talking about the analyst model. But the point I especially want to make is that all of these pieces are themselves models used by the agent. And so I want to talk about the interaction between these two, how we as economists should think about building our models to take account of the fact that the agents we're modeling are themselves using models to guide their thinking. So I want to split this into a couple of parts. We'll talk for a bit about the preference piece of this, and then we'll talk a bit about the belief piece of this. Now let's talk about preferences first. We tend to describe this, as I said, with a utility function. Now, in one sense, I think utility functions, I especially want to focus on one piece of that, namely the notion of marginal utility, which plays such an important role in what we do, is one of the more embarrassing things that we talk about. And why is it one of the more embarrassing things? Because over the course of a student's career in economics, several times we tell the student essentially, remember what we told you last time? Well, forget that, and we'll try again. So here's what I have in mind. The career of an economics student. You get into introductory economics. These are either direct quotes or paraphrases from texts or lecture notes. We tell in introductory economics there's a law of diminishing marginal utility. Even stronger than the law of demand, which we explained is really not quite a law, even though we call it a law. A law of diminishing marginal utility, and this is typically described in terms of some strength of preference, and usually backed up by a story about eating too much of something. And then similarly at this level, we're typically telling people that we can motivate policies like progressive taxation on the basis of different people in different economic situations have different marginal utilities. So at this point, marginal utility is real, it's about strength of preference, and there's even some comparability across people. Then in the US, at least, we get them into introductory economics. And indeed, we tell them, forget all of that. We're not going to worry about marginal utility anymore. All we need is indifference curves curve the right way. They're convex. And that's a statement about the marginal rate of substitution, nothing to do with marginal utility. And then we also tell them utility functions are unique only up to increasing transformations. So comparability is out the window as well. Then we get them in our first year in graduate school. And we teach them about uncertainty, and suddenly utility's cardinal again. Marginal utility's back, it's meaningful, but this time has nothing to do with strength of preference, it's all about risk attitudes. And then we get them in a second year graduate course, perhaps, and we teach them Harsanyi's aggregation theorem, or the Dillon and Mertens version of the Harsanyi aggregation theorem. And now utility's comparable again. In fact, seemingly innocuous axioms. All Harsanyi needs is an assumption of expected utility theory. It's an amazing rabbit out of the hat result. You assume the individuals are expected utility maximizers. You assume the planner's an expected utility maximizer. The weakest Pareto axiom you can imagine, and out comes utilitarianism. And Dillon and Mertens go even further. They erase the coefficients. with axioms that again seem remarkably weak. So now comparability is back, and marginal utility is meaningful again. The last quote is from a book I happen to be reading at the moment, so I came across this just a couple of days ago by an eminent economist, and the point of this is this person is willing to just add up gains and losses and see whether the result is positive or negative and say that's good or bad. So now, not only do we have comparable utility, the coefficients are gone, and we know the shape of the utility function. It's linear in money. And so this is, a good number of times over the course of economics education where we've switched direction on utility. So a basic question here, is it meaningful to say something like moving from allocation W to X is better than, in whatever sense you want to think about better than moving from Y to Z? That's essentially a question of, is marginal utility meaningful? Now, there are various ways that you can make that meaningful that don't rely on risk preferences. Not everyone buys this. I've talked to decision theorists who will thump the table and say firmly, in their view, there's no way to make sense of any kind of cardinality, any kind of strength of preference, any kind of utility comparisons without having uncertainty so that you can look at preferences over lotteries, so that you can interpret marginal utility in terms of risk preferences. However, others would disagree. Here's one of several results that I especially like. Suppose we think like we usually do. We have an individual who has preferences. They're described by a preference relation over alternatives. X is indifferent to Y, X is better than Y, X is worse than Y. Suppose this person also has a relation of comparing pairs to pairs. I write it as WX RYZ, and that's interpreted as a move from W to X is better than a move from Y to Z. That's interpreted as an increment to income is worth more to me when I'm poor than when I'm rich, or some statement like that. If the person can also make statements like that, then the result is this person's preferences are represented by a utility function that is unique up to affine transformations, that is cardinal again, in which marginal utility has meaning. Now, I mentioned this to the decision theorists who happily thump the table and say marginal utility only makes sense in a world of risk. And they say, yeah, but how would you ever observe this relation R? How would you ever do the kind of revealed preference thing that we think we should be able to do with preferences? How would you pose to someone the choice is move from W to X better than a move from Y to Z or not? Now, my response there is we could observe this if we think preferences are separable. If we can write preferences as, my pointer, if we can write our preferences as the sum of functions over some collection of commodities here and some collection of commodities here, and we write them like this, there's no interaction between them, then we can really think of a revealed preference exercise giving us this kind of preference. We can think of asking about movements from W to X here and asking how much of a trade-off here we need to compensate for that, and we could elicit this preference relation. Now, finally, I'm going to bring this rather long story back to the question of models. Should we think of preferences as being separable? Separable preferences have lots of other nice properties. It's easy to find experiments, it's easy to find empirical work arguing that at least in the domains that they look at, preferences do not look separable, that this is doing some rather savagery to our representation of the agent. So my next observation would be, we can think of separability on two levels. And in both of them, I'm going to argue that separability is not only sensible, but is essential. Let's start, I would say, I can interpret a separable utility function like this as representing a model used by the agent. I'm going to think of this as a device the agent uses to organize their thinking about the world. I'm going to suggest that when any one of us in this room has a decision to make, the first thing we do is identify the considerations that matter for that decision and identify the ones that don't matter, and we throw out all the ones that don't matter and we restrict attention to the ones that do, and what we've essentially done is acted as if our preferences are separable. And I would suggest not only do we do that, but that one can't imagine not doing that. If we don't believe our preferences are separable, then essentially we should be thinking of ourselves, we should be modeling our agents as making probably one decision in their lifetime, possibly when they're born, possibly a bit earlier when they're born, and that decision would lay out a complete contingent plan for the rest of their life. And all we're doing now is carrying through these plans that we adopted at that time. Indeed, if you think there are bequest motives, if there's intergenerational altruism, if you care about your kids, then if you're going to argue that preferences are not separable, now we have to commit to there was one decision made once, perhaps by Adam and Eve, that laid out a contingent plan for all the rest of our species, and all we're doing is carrying out that plan. Now, you don't have to believe in Adam and Eve. You can put in something else instead of Adam and Eve. You can think of mitochondrial Eve, who people talk about in presumably in Africa some time ago, but sometime there has to have been this initial decision. If that's not the case, then essentially we're saying preferences are separable. To put these ideas together, then, I would suggest that we should be thinking about marginal utility, about utility as having some cardinal aspect to it, that we should think that it's meaningful to express this in terms of strength of preference. We should think that it's meaningful to think about this in a revealed preference sense of as something we really could elicit experimentally if we wanted to. And we should think about that, or we should be willing to buy into that, because that's the only way that we can make sense of how people can make decisions. That once we realize that the agents in our models themselves have to model their environment before they make the decision. Now, I said I would come to some questions. And so once we recognize that, we have to realize that the way the agent separates the various components of the agent's decision problem are going to depend on the question the agent faces, the context in which the agent finds that question. Now, to think about this, I want to go back to another short history lesson, this time not the life of a single agent, but I'm going to look at how we think about utility over the course of economics. I'm going to start with the utilitarians. Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill come to mind. I think Jeremy Bentham is so much fun that I always put a slide of him in his current form on a slide whenever I can, but I didn't find a good way to fit it on the slide, so you have to imagine that. But for Bentham and Mill, utility, this was a substantive concept. What I mean by substantive is that utilities were real. They took the form of pain or pleasure. And these were the things that prompted us to make the decisions that we did. We get, half a century later, we have Edgeworth and the marginal utilitarians. For them, utility was still a real thing. Edgeworth hypothesized that he didn't have one yet, but he imagined developing a hedonometer where you could actually, I presume, plug this into someone somehow, and you could measure their utilities. And then this was regarded as unscientific, at least as long as we couldn't measure utilities. Especially influential was the Vienna School of the 1930s, the philosophy of science view that all science should be based only on observational things. And utility was a bit of a problem for that. It doesn't seem to have deterred the cosmologists. They have these same kinds of difficulties, but utility was a bit of a problem for that. And so there appeared the revealed preference theory that argued utility is just an analytical device, a collection of mathematical symbols that allow us to describe behavior that we can observe. And that was fine for a while. Now, more recently, behavioral economics has become prominent. And very often in behavioral economics, utilities are substantive again instead of just representational. Not all the time, but we readily find stories in behavioral economics about people being in hot and cold states, about people being in system 1 or system 2. These are stories about substantive utilities, and so those have come back. And more recently, we have work in neuroeconomics where we can actually see the realization of Edgeworth's hodometer. I put up a couple of pictures of here from fascinating work by Wolfram Schultz from Cambridge and co-authors, not with people, but with various sorts of primates, because it turns out you can intervene in their brains the way that it's hard to get past human subjects if you're proposing to do this with people. And so they're measuring the activity of individual neurons in the brains of these agents. They're giving them alternatives between which they can choose, and they are eliciting what they describe as utility functions. And so I show a couple of observations here. The dots are observations elicited on a single day. The curves are the summary of observations elicited over months' worth of such days. They elicit these observations. They use them to make out-of-sample predictions in a pretty convincing way. I want two aspects of this that I want you to note. One is that this comes pretty close, in my view, to evidence that we have substantive utilities that we can measure. And the second is that there's a sort of S-shape to these kinds of things. What significance does the S shape have? If we believe, finally we're going to come back more firmly to models. If we believe that utilities are substantive, if we believe there is a notion of marginal utility that has meaning beyond risk preferences, if we believe it's meaningful to make statements about whether an extra quantity of something, a shift from one thing to another, is more valuable in one circumstance than another. If we believe then that this is rooted in agents having these separable utility functions, the thing we have to expect is that the agents will separate things in different ways depending on the context, depending on the question they face. In particular, the agents will adjust essentially the utility functions that they apply. So this is the first place where, as I said, I shamelessly mention a collection of work that I have found particularly interesting over the years. This is work that asks, if you were a principal, you meaning the person who's writing the paper, if you were a principal taking the role of evolution, this is the kind of thing that will drive a biologist crazy to speak in these terms, but calls to mind principal agent models for us. If you were a principal, if you were designing an agent, you have no incentive problem here. You get to design the agent. But you do have some constraints. The constraints you have is that you have to motivate your agent with the kind of activity that we saw in the previous slide that the neuroeconomists are discovering. You have to motivate your activity by your agent by events in this agent's brain. And you face two constraints. There are limits to how strong you can make these events. And there are limits to the agent's precision. And so your trade-off is this. If you would like the agent to choose A instead of B, you can cause A and B each to prompt events in this agent's brain. You make the events that they prompt far apart, and the agent's very reliably going to choose the higher one. Make them close together, the agent's going to be noisier. Sometimes we'll choose the better one, sometimes not the better one. Result seems obvious. Spread them far apart. The difficulty with spreading them far apart is if B is the better one, and so you put all of your positive reinforcement in the B that you can find within the limits of the system you have to deal with. A is not so good, and so that's at the bottom. And then you wonder, what happens when C comes along that's better than B? And essentially you have no room. It's like the gymnast judge who gives the first one who goes a 9.9. And now what do you do when some better ones come along? So how do you solve that? You, the principal, adjust the utilities that you're attaching to things, adjust the sensations in the brain that you're attaching things to match the important range of decisions. And so if we think about there being large feasible set that this person is facing, you want to identify where the action is in that feasible set, and you want to make the utility function steep there, so there are big differences between those decisions, so you get relatively precise decisions. But then you've run out of room, and so it has to be flat elsewhere, which is to say it's going to look like an S. It's going to have a relatively flat tail where things don't matter very much. It's going to have a relatively flat upper tail where things don't matter very much. And it's going to be steep in the middle. And this steep in the middle is going to vary depending upon the circumstances of the agent. This is a phenomenon that is commonly studied in psychology under a phrase like hedonic treadmill. There's good experimental evidence for it there. This is a phenomenon that shows up in the neuroeconomic experiments as well. You can, if you're a neuroeconomist, you can produce pictures that look just like the S's in that previous diagram, but where the steep spot of the S is in quite different places, depending on what kind of alternatives you are habitually offering to your subjects. And offer your subjects choices between relatively meager rewards, and the S will drift downward, so the steep spot is right where all of those rewards are coming. Switch them to relatively lucrative rewards, and the steep spot will shift upward, again, to where those decisions have to be made. In our terms, this person, or these subjects, have separable utility functions. The domain of separability is shaped by the common experience that they face, and the utility functions on these domains shape so that you focus the discrimination on the relevant sets. At one level, I think this is compelling. You read Shakespeare. The characters in the Shakespeare plays had per capita incomes that were a tiny fraction of ours. But they don't seem any less contented with life than we were. They don't seem subject to, I think, the sort of depression one of us would find if suddenly we were faced with a Shakespearean standard of living. We are capable of making decisions that wouldn't even show up in their utility functions. And the explanation for that is that we have organized our utility functions differently than they have. We have moved the steep spots of our utility functions to where it matters, as have they. Now, so there's the first question then. If we think this kind of thing is the way agents make decisions, what do we make of welfare economics? How do we evaluate economic policies if responses in the things, changes in the things we can affect with our economic policies, if changes in income, changes in living standards are going to in turn prompt changes in the models the agents use to make their decisions? How do we compare the well-being of an agent today with the utility function that agent has today with the well-being of that same agent in a new environment, recognizing that the utility function is going to adjust to reflect that new environment? That's something I think is very important, something we have very little understanding of. The nation of Bhutan has officially abandoned gross national product, gross domestic product, any measure like that as a measure of its well-being, and now has amongst its official statistics, gross national happiness. Now, on the one hand, we all know that GNP, GDP have all sorts of shortcomings. But if we believe that decisions follow this kind of pattern, gross national happiness is going to be a problematic one as well. Okay, so the next one, we do quite a bit more quickly. I said the ambiguity of the title would allow me to switch between the agent and the analyst, still continuing with the separability. In many cases, the separability of utility function is something the analyst adopts because that's the only way we can typically make sense of the data that we have. Most obvious one is we study intertemporal preferences by some of discounted utility. Now, basic difficulty arises there. Think about intertemporal preferences. How long should the period be when we take that summation? It's going to depend a lot on what we're studying. If we think of a day as the length of a period, and we're studying what someone has for lunch, separability probably fails. What you had yesterday has an effect on your preferences today. That's easy enough. Make the period longer. Look at a month, let's say. That's probably long enough. But if we're thinking about where someone goes on vacation, a month is probably not long enough. Where you went last year probably has an effect on where you went this year. So we make it, a year, or maybe now we're up to several years or a decade. If we're talking about savings for retirement, might need a longer period than that. Once we do that, we're losing all the detail that goes inside of this. And so some of the work that I mentioned up there, again, continue to my theme of focusing on things that I've been attracted by, is thinking about how we might construct utility functions that allow us to view some decisions on a short period basis, some decisions on a longer period basis. Think about risk preferences. When we look at someone's behavior and try to infer their risk preferences, we're looking at this behavior in the context of a collection of decisions they have made already. And these decisions they have made typically include commitments that will affect their attitude towards risk. For example, someone who has a mortgage might have a different view of financial risk in the rest of their portfolio than someone who does not. Someone who has a defined benefit retirement plan might have a different attitude than someone who does not. When we measure intertemporal preferences, when we measure risk preferences, we're measuring what I call the induced preferences that are generated by the person's other decisions, is generated by the person's context. What we would really like to know is the person's deep preferences. In particular, if we would like to know something about the effects of policy, if we would like to evaluate counterfactuals, we'd really like to have their deep preferences. And so this is the second question. I said I would do this one more quickly, that I would put up, that I think we need to spend a lot more time on. How do we learn, how do we make inferences about people's deep preferences from the induced preferences that we can observe from their behavior? Okay, we put utility aside. And if I go the right way, let's talk about beliefs now. So this is the other half of this decision problem that I had to talk about. Now, usually we think beliefs are easy. We're all good Bayesians. We describe the person's uncertainty with a prior distribution. We describe their updating with Bayes' rule, and everything works wonderfully. Some difficulties, though, kind of creep in here. We know that if we describe participants in interactions by Bayes' rule, that some kind of very interesting, very simple impossibility results show up. Two of my favorites, Ullmann's "It's impossible to agree to disagree," and Milgram and Spokey's "No trade theorem." Let's think about the no-trade theorem. I mean, what's the no-trade theorem tell us? It tells us that if we have an economy subject to uncertainty, we have an initial allocation that's efficient, and then some new information arrives. That new information does not provoke any more trade. That's why it's called the no-trade theorem. A little bit of a problem for those who listen to NPR. Every day has a market report, and every day there's a story about why the market went up or down that day. And usually that story has something to do with new information and beliefs. So, someone released an earnings report. There was information about an election. Was an interesting one recently. Or there's some other news. All right, so the story always sounds reasonably convincing, but it's a bit of a problem for the no-trade theorem. Now, what should we think about the no-trade theorem? One possible response is that when you think about it more carefully, the no-trade theorem is maybe a feature rather than a bug. What do I mean by that? Suppose, forget about uncertainty, let's just go back to general competitive equilibrium. What would the counterpart of the no-trade theorem be in a competitive equilibrium setting? It would be, if you have an outcome that's already Pareto efficient, then you don't need to trade to get to an efficient outcome. It would be essentially the second welfare theorem, which tells us choose any efficient outcome you can find a way to support that as a competitive equilibrium. And that's considered a great victory in theory of competitive equilibrium. And it doesn't puzzle us. We say, well, there's no surprise that we see people trading with one another because the initial endowment is not efficient. And we have to trade to get from the inefficient initial endowment to an efficient competitive equilibrium. And so in that view, the no-trade theorem is just a statement, if the initial endowment's efficient, no problem. If it's not, you're going to see some trade. Now, it's true the no-trade theorem adds this information and uncertainty, and so that takes a little bit more work. But given that you can, in the model, you can make contingent trades, you can condition your trade on the eventual resolution of the uncertainty, that's not a great leap. The difficulty with that is we also have people in our profession who very firmly believe in efficient markets. And what does it mean to believe in efficient markets? It means you can't say, suppose the initial endowment is not efficient, because you believe that the market always produces an efficient outcome. And yet you see trade in these markets. And so there's a couple of quotes there from people who were presidents of the American Financial Association in their presidential addresses. And essentially what they're saying is, we believe in efficient markets, and we understand the no trade theorem, and we look out the window when we see lots of trade, and so, is roughly what these quotes mean. And this is an interesting thing about economics. Some disciplines worry that they have things that work in theory, but they don't work in practice. We worry because we have things that work in practice that don't work in theory. And, what would I point to? We have a long experimental tradition of things like double auction markets that very reliably find the competitive equilibrium. And yet we don't have a model that explains why that works. All of our competitive models depend on having arbitrarily large markets, not the handful of traders who suffice in the experiments. And similarly, we have financial markets where lots of activity goes on. We have prediction markets, which are very popular. Iowa electronic political prediction market was one of the pioneers, but there is now an industry in designing prediction markets for firms and other organizations to make decisions. If you think about it, you should be troubled by that. If you believe that people are good Bayesians and you believe the no trade theorem, you should see no trade in the prediction market. If you see trade in the prediction market, then you should worry that maybe these people aren't perfect Bayesians, in which case you ought to be worried about the prediction that's coming out of the prediction market. And so this is another place where the theory is a little bit behind on this. Now, what do we make of this? The most common response to the no trade theorem is to allow different prior beliefs. And Stephen Morris was one of the first sort of path-breaking exercises in that. A comment, you have to indulge in different prior beliefs with a vengeance for this to get you out of the problem. Because the no trade theorem doesn't require identical priors, only concordant priors. We won't worry about what they are. And I would suggest that what we're exposing here is not the idea, not that it's a strong assumption to assume that people have similar beliefs, but we ought to go back further than that. I'd say the basic difficulty is when these agents, when people analyze the uncertainty they face, they're very likely to do it with different state spaces, with different models. You think about state spaces, we usually go back to Savage in the foundation of statistics. And Savage says, let's think about what a state is, and suggests if we take it literally, it's easy to say what a state is. It is, it specifies the exact and entire past, present, and future history of the universe. That's what a state would be. And if that were the case, then we would all have the same state space, and we would never have to worry about people having different models. The only difficulty is it's a little hard to say, you get up in the morning, you have a little time before you have to go to work, and so you'll spend that imagining the exact and entire past, present, and future history of the universe. It's going to be a bit cumbersome to do. And so Savage has in mind that people take this ideal state space and they partition it. And they partition it, the elements in their partition become the states in their model. They partition it in a way that captures the important information and throws out the unimportant information. So you go into a probability class, and typically the first thing you study is flipping a coin or rolling a die or something like that. And so if you're flipping a coin, you say, well, I know I should be thinking about the entire history of the universe, but I'm going to separate into those histories that cause this thing to come up heads and those that cause it to come up tails. And now I've got two states in my model, and I can assign probabilities to those, and off I go. If I'm going to roll a die, I have to partition it a little more finely. I'm going to get 6 states instead of 2, but still manageable. If we're going to think about people reasoning about uncertainty in terms of state spaces and probabilities, we have to be buying into the fact that they must first construct a model of the uncertainty that they face. And then I would suggest that we have to think that people will very likely construct different models. Savage talks about small worlds and large worlds. I suggest this distinction, that we have a small worlds problem, that if we can pose to people a question about which they must reason and reliably expect them to partition the history of the universe in the same way, so they come up with the same state space, with beliefs that are at least equivalent. Equivalent means mutually absolutely continuous. No zero probability events for one person that are positive probability events for another person, because that's just a way of smuggling different states into the state space. Now, Savage tells us that we should do this Bayesian thing only if we're in a small worlds setting. And in fact, Savage says it would be utterly ridiculous, it would be preposterous to think about a large world setting in a Bayesian way. Now, where's the dividing line between large worlds and small worlds? That's hard to say. I'll give an example. Let's suppose a month ago, maybe 6 weeks ago, you were asked who was likely to win the next presidential election in the US, and each of us in this room would think about the uncertainty that we have to imagine, and we would construct a state space, and my guess is no two of us would come up with the same state space. And so I put that clearly in the large worlds problem. Savage gives some example. He indicates that a large worlds problem, playing chess is. He says planning a picnic is too complicated to handle with a Bayesian model. And so I'm happy enough to think that much of our economy is more complicated than planning a picnic. I would not think that, say, if I were vetting the next chair of the Federal Reserve or the next finance minister, that if I said, are you good at planning picnics? And this person said yes, that would be enough. And so I think we should, in general, be thinking about large worlds problems. And so some of the work I've done there has been on asking, how can we expect people to interact? In particular, how can we expect their beliefs to respond to their interaction? The kind of questions that lie behind the no-trade theorem when they have different models. Now, I've used the phrase different models several times. What kind of thing might we be talking about when we're thinking about different models? If we're going to talk about no-trade theorems, that conjures up asset markets. So here are some examples of the kinds of things I have in mind for different models. This I pulled from a website, a financial advice website, and this was telling us these are the considerations that we think are important when we're evaluating an asset. And so essentially, this is this person's statement of, here's the model that we're going to use, or here's the state space that we're going to use to organize our thinking. It's a kind of long list. Many of those things I have no idea what they mean, but it's surely not an exhaustive list. It doesn't give us the entire history of the universe. So there's one. A couple clicks more, I came up with this one, which tells us, roughly, this site also has a model, and it's a different one than the other model. And my guess is we could put these two analysts in a room with one another, and they could talk endlessly about why they thought the various pieces of their model were important, why they've partitioned the history of the universe in the way that they have, and they would never change their views. Now, the possibilities, once you start on this, just turn out to be endless. Here's a person would tell us, forget all of this analysis stuff. You don't need to know anything about the asset. What you want to see is its time series. And this person explained, this is a classic. You see this, and you describe this in terms of, there's this price ceiling here. And this asset is just anxious to break through that price ceiling. And you can see it takes a run at it here and gets pushed back. And that makes this cup. Takes another run, gets pushed back, but not so far. That's the handle. This is called a cup and handle pattern. And when you see that, you know it's about to break through. And look what happens when it does. And so right there, you want to strike on that one. So this is another model of how we should be thinking about this, completely different than the other two. Here's one. This is a financial advice website again, based on the zodiac. And so this is Apple Computer, and these numbers have things to do with the planets or the sun and the moon or the stars. I'm not sure what, but we're supposed to be able to look at that and know what to do. And then I mentioned efficient markets, so we could find, we wouldn't have to go very far to find people who would believe this is the right model for how to think about these assets. And you might say that, this one, for example, is a curiosity that there might be people out there who do this, but we wouldn't expect there to be very much money behind this. But on the other hand, if this one is right, as many people believe, then there really could be a whole lot of money behind that one, or any of the others. These are the kinds of things I have in mind when I say we should be thinking about people who have different models of the uncertainty of the environment that they face. And so I want to go back. This is my third question. How do we think about interactions between agents when they have different models of the uncertainty they're facing? Many of the existing results we have, results about merging of beliefs, have to go by the wayside. And yet, again, we think that sometimes interactions, markets, seem to work very reasonably well. We have models of how they can work reasonably well when the agents all have the same model. We know very little about what happens when they don't. And of course, every now and then we see things like financial markets in 2008 that once again suggests sometimes things do work in our models and don't work in practice instead of the reverse. And so we need some ways of thinking about that. All right, going to differences in beliefs. Suppose we have two agents who have different beliefs. Suppose they want to make a trade. How should we think about that? Our usual response is they both want to trade. There are mutual gains here. This is Pareto improving. Surely we should like this. What if the gains from trade come from the fact that they have different beliefs? What if, from our point of view, this looks like a bet that they're making? Now, one view is, yes, we should still believe there are gains from trade here. Consumers, people's preferences, these are sovereign. If they think they're going to be better off, we have no reason to question this. A possible response to that is, if this trade is really a bet, if it depends on their having different beliefs, at least one of them has to be wrong. And so it's not obvious that we should view this as a Pareto improving trade. The doctrinaire decision theorists would respond to this with, that doesn't make any sense. Under a representational view of beliefs and utilities, there are no separate things, such as beliefs and utilities. There's nothing meaningful called a belief or utility. These are analytical devices. These are symbols, constructs that we, the analysts, created to describe the behavior. But behind that behavior is just preferences, and there's no arguing with preferences, usually put in Latin that I won't try to pronounce. And so under this view, there's no way to say people are incorrect in their beliefs. Now, I suggest that even the most doctrinaire revealed preference people don't really believe that. And as evidence, I would say, we very often think it makes no sense to argue about whether someone should like something or not. But it does make sense to say that someone should believe something. So you may think it's kind of strange to tell someone like the 41st President of the United States that they should like broccoli. But it does make sense to tell them they should believe broccoli is good for them. And so we seem to have a different view of beliefs and preferences. If I were to offer you a lottery, I'll pay you some sum of money if, let's say at least 3 people retire from your department in the next 5 years. How would you think about that? Under the pure revealed preference point of view, you have to say, that lottery is worth $72 to me, or whatever it is. And I infer from that I must think it's likely that this is what's going to happen to my colleagues over the next few years. I guess most people, instead of that, would start asking now, how old is this person? What has this person said about what their future plans might be? They're starting by assessing beliefs. So I think it's meaningful to talk about people having beliefs. It's meaningful to people to talk about having different beliefs. This is part of their having different models. Then once again, how do we talk about changes in welfare? And so one of the things I've done with Zaki Gilboa and David Schmeidler, and my apologies for spelling David's name incorrectly in one place up there, is talk about a notion that we called no batting Pareto, and a nice paper by Brunemeyer and Simset and Xiong that has a very similar notion. And our goal in doing this was to strengthen the Pareto criterion or weaken it, depending on which way you're looking at it, depending on whether you're a glass half full or half empty person, that would embrace as Pareto improvements trades that were not pure bets, and exclude those that are beneficial only because people have different beliefs. And so we had some interesting, we thought, ideas about this, but not necessarily very useful ideas. In particular, these always make fewer judgments than does the original Pareto notion. And so let's assume, again, you're hired by a new administration to be their economic advisor, and you say, economic policy is easy. Look for Pareto improvements and do them, and then you're done. And the difficulty is pretty soon a question is going to come along that's not a Pareto improvement. And so having a Pareto notion that rules out gains best based on different beliefs, that was an intriguing notion. It was one that was fun to work out, but doesn't exactly help us give policy advice, doesn't help us evaluate our economy. And so this is my next question. We need more thought on how we're going to think about welfare when people have different beliefs or different models of the uncertainty that they face. Now, watching with some trepidation the clock go by, this one is a little briefer. We have to talk about updating. And typically this is really straightforward. Updating is based on Bayes' rule. Now, we have good reason to believe that Bayes' rule can be problematic. Behavioral economists, psychologists would tell us that there's good evidence that people are not always good Bayesians. More recently, interestingly, the machine learning literature suggests that Bayes' rule is often intractable. It's computing the integral that you need for the normalization that they find especially daunting. And so just when you would think that extraordinary computing power has made all sorts of things tractable that never were, we find the machine learners saying, you know what, we've discovered that Bayes' rule is just too hard for us, and we need alternative ways of doing updating. So I think we need to talk about people who update other than by Bayes' rule. Now, of course, there's a lot of work. Much of behavioral economics, by no means all of it, but much of behavioral economics is concerned with people who are not Bayesian when they do their updating, typically based on people who have correct models, or where the models are just taken for granted. Parallel to that, we have the literature on misspecification that typically starts by saying, suppose someone has an incorrect model of their environment, suppose they're misspecified, but then they're good Bayesians in updating that. And what I would suggest is that we need to put these two together. We need to capture the possibility that someone may have an incorrect model and may not be a Bayesian. And this is more than just taking two things that were interesting in their own right and going like that with them and seeing what happens, or more than just generality for generality's sake. We should expect then that someone who recognizes the difficulty in updating, someone who understands that they may not be a perfect Bayesian, may take this into account when forming the model with which they're going to examine their uncertainty. Now, this idea that someone may take into account the updating difficulties they're going to have when forming their initial beliefs, this may sound a bit unorthodox, may sound a bit heretical. And so what happens when you're accused of heresy? You're asked typically first to read your scripture. And so let's read the relevant scripture here. I have Luce and Rafa talking about beliefs arising out of a process of jockeying, of adjusting, of forming beliefs, working through where they lead, seeing whether you like where they lead, and possibly reevaluating. We have Savage talking about how the role of the theory of probability is to detect inconsistencies and then to correct them by changing your model of the world. A similar quote from Di Finetti. Indeed, Savage is reputed to have first fallen prey to the Allais paradox, and in response to Allais' triumphant gotcha, responded, well, no, now that I understand this, I've changed, and now here's what I would do. I will suggest that this is a quite familiar idea. And so this is my next question. We need to think about how people form their beliefs instead of just having these beliefs tumble from divine inspiration or from the mind of the modeler, when they recognize that there's going to be subsequent frictions in their updating. And if we had lots more time, I would finally stop just flashing names up here and tell you about work that Jakob Steiner and I have recently been doing that we find quite interesting on how people jointly form beliefs and updating rules. But we don't have a lot more time. So this gets postponed. Look at all that wonderful stuff going by. And my summary, I put 3 bullet points up there. First one is, as I said, we can think about models in 2 places. Analysts use models to study agents who use models. And at both stages, or this gives rise to an interaction that we need to think more about when we do our economics. The third bullet point is open. That's anticipating where I would be in terms of time. I leave it to you to fill in the third bullet point, and I just say thank you.